The smile that changed everything. It was supposed to be a calm evening. Keanu Reeves stood near the edge of the quiet studio set, his hands in his pockets, his eyes reflecting the soft golden light that fell through the half-open blinds. Filming had gone well that day. The crew was wrapping up, laughter echoing lightly through the space. For once, everything seemed peaceful. Then Sandra Bullock walked in. Her laughter filled the room like a melody he hadn't heard in years. She was radiant, dressed simply, her hair tied loosely, her energy warm and familiar. Keanu's calm was steady, like it always was, but that smile, her smile, somehow cracked through his usual stillness. But she wasn't smiling at him. Steve Rogers, the new face in the project, young, confident, and charming, had just said something that made Sandra laugh. Not the quiet kind of laugh she gave out of politeness, but the deep, natural one that came from her heart. And that, for some reason Keanu couldn't explain, made his chest tighten. He looked away quickly, pretending to check his phone. But his reflection on the screen betrayed what he was trying to hide, a flicker of emotion, one he hadn't felt in a long time. For years, Keanu had trained himself to stay grounded. He was calm in chaos, gentle in storms, and kind in moments when most people would lose their temper. But that day, he realized something unexpected. Even the calmest hearts can tremble when they see something they didn't expect to feel again. Sandra noticed him. Their eyes met briefly, and she smiled this time at him. A soft, knowing smile that seemed to say, "You still think too much, don't you?" He smiled back gently. The kind of smile that hides more than it reveals. But inside, something had shifted. The next few days on set felt different. Sandra and Steve shared jokes between takes, talked about their scenes, and sometimes stayed behind to rehearse together. Keanu watched quietly, his thoughts a storm behind his calm face. He wasn't jealous, at least, not in the way most people would think. It was something deeper, quieter. It was the ache of realizing that time had moved on, that life had given him peace but taken away the spark he once carried. Sandra had always been special to him, not because of fame or beauty, but because she saw through the quiet. She saw him, and now, as he watched her laugh with someone else, he wondered if that connection was gone. One evening, as they finished shooting a powerful emotional scene, the director called it a day. Everyone began to leave, but Sandra stayed behind. She walked over to Keanu, her face thoughtful. "You've been quiet," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "I'm always quiet." "No," she said, shaking her head. "This is different. You've been distant." There was concern in her voice, but also warmth. Keanu looked at her, his calm returning. "Just tired, maybe. You know how it is." She studied him for a moment, then smiled again. "You always hide behind calm words." He didn't deny it. Instead, he gave a gentle nod. "And you always find ways to see through them." She laughed, a quiet, heartfelt laugh. But there was something else in her eyes, a shadow of understanding, maybe even guilt. As they stepped outside, the cool night air greeted them. The studio lights faded behind, and the sound of the city filled the silence between them. "Steve's good," Keanu said suddenly. Sandra looked at him, surprised. He's talented." "Why?" Keanu shrugged lightly. "Just saying. He brings energy to the room." "He does," she said. "He reminds me of how we were when we started, full of dreams, scared but excited." Keanu nodded, his gaze distant. "And fearless enough to smile without thinking." Sandra tilted her head. "What does that mean?" He smiled gently. "It means I miss that kind of freedom." For a moment, neither spoke. The wind carried a faint chill, and somewhere in the distance, a car horn echoed. Sandra looked down, then said softly, "You haven't lost it, Keanu. You've just learned to protect it." He didn't answer. Because deep inside, he knew she was wrong. He hadn't protected it. He had buried it. Later that night, as he sat in his car, the city lights blurred through the rain-streaked window. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He thought of Sandra's smile, of Steve's laughter, of the years that had quietly slipped away between them. He wasn't angry. He wasn't heartbroken. He was simply human. He remembered something his mother once told him. A calm heart is not one that never feels pain, but one that knows how to hold it gently. And that night, Keanu held his pain gently. But deep within that calm, something fragile began to stir again, something he thought he had lost forever. A quiet longing, and somewhere beneath it all, hope. The silence between smiles the next morning came with a soft drizzle. The city looked calm, washed clean, and peaceful. Keanu arrived early on set as always, dressed in his usual simple black jacket and quiet smile. He liked to be there before anyone else, before the noise, before the lights, before the eyes. It gave him time to think, time to breathe. But that morning, he wasn't thinking about his lines. His thoughts were still with last night, with the way Sandra had looked at him when she said he was protecting his heart. He kept hearing that voice in his mind, soft but sharp like truth always is. When Sandra arrived, she was her usual cheerful self. She brought coffee for the crew, joked with the assistants, and laughed at something Steve said about a clumsy stunt rehearsal. The set felt alive again. Keanu smiled politely but stayed a little away, observing. Steve noticed it too. During a break, he came up to Keanu. "Hey man, big fan. Seriously, I grew up watching your movies." Keanu nodded humbly. "Thank you, Steve, that means a lot." "It's wild working with you," Steve continued, enthusiasm shining in his voice. "You're so calm like nothing shakes you." Keanu chuckled lightly. "Everything shakes everyone, Steve, some just shake quietly." Steve blinked, not sure how to respond. "That's deep, man." Keanu smiled, ending the conversation gently. But as Steve walked away, Keanu's eyes followed him briefly, not with envy, but with understanding. He saw himself in that young man, eager, brave, unaware of the weight time would one day put on his heart. Hours later, they filmed a scene where Keanu's character had to confess unspoken love. Sandra stood opposite him, playing her role, but for a moment the line between acting and truth blurred. "I kept it inside," Keanu's character said softly, "because sometimes silence is safer than words." The room went still. Even the crew seemed to forget to breathe. When the director yelled, "Cut!" no one moved. Sandra's eyes were glistening. She looked at Keanu for a long second, not as an actor, not as a co-star, but as someone who understood exactly what those words meant. He gave her a faint, knowing smile. She looked down quickly, pretending to check her script, but her hands trembled slightly. Later, during lunch, Sandra found him sitting alone near the back lot, sipping coffee and watching the rain begin again. She sat beside him quietly. For a while neither spoke. Then she said softly, "That scene felt real." He nodded. "It did," she hesitated, then asked, "Was it?" Keanu looked at her, his expression calm but distant. "Every truth finds its way into what we do, sometimes without meaning to." Sandra sighed gently. "You always make simple words sound heavy." He smiled faintly. "Maybe because I carry them longer than most." She looked at him, wanting to say something more, but couldn't find the words. She just nodded slowly and said, "You shouldn't carry alone." He looked at her with quiet warmth. "You shouldn't feel guilty for what you can't fix." Those words hit her harder than she expected. She bit her lip and looked away. "You think that's what I feel?" "I know you," he said softly. "You always try to make things right even when they were never wrong." For a moment, silence filled the air between them. The kind of silence that says more than words ever could. As the rain grew stronger, Sandra stood up. "Come on, they'll need us back soon." Keanu nodded, standing slowly. But before they walked back, she turned and asked quietly, "Do you ever wish we had talked more back then?" He looked at her for a long second. "Maybe, but maybe silence was how we protected what we had." She smiled sadly. "And what did we have?" He smiled faintly. "Something that never really left." The next few days moved fast. News spread that the film was already gaining early attention. Interviews, media visits, and rehearsals filled every hour. But between the noise, there were glances. Quiet, soft, unfinished glances between Keanu and Sandra that both of them pretended not to notice. One evening, after a long interview session, Sandra saw Keanu sitting near the studio exit, alone again, scrolling through an old picture on his phone. She stepped closer. It was from years ago, the two of them during the filming of Speed, smiling freely, young and full of dreams. "You kept that?" she asked. He smiled lightly. "Some moments deserve to stay." She smiled too, but her voice dropped lower. "Some moments deserve a second chance." He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time in years, she saw the same warmth she remembered from long ago. But before he could say anything, Steve's voice echoed from across the hallway. "Hey, Sandra, we're heading out for dinner. You coming?" Sandra hesitated, then looked at Keanu. There was a pause, a heartbeat stretched between them. "Go ahead," he said gently. "You should." She nodded slowly, then walked away. As the door closed behind her, Keanu looked at the photo again. His calm face didn't move, but behind that calm, a quiet ache deepened. Later that night, he wrote something in his notebook, something he hadn't written in years. "You can't stop time. But maybe if you're lucky, you can meet the same soul twice in one lifetime." He closed the book softly, leaned back, and whispered to himself, "If it's meant, it will find its way again." And somewhere, far away under the city lights, Sandra sat in a car, staring out of the window, thinking of the same smile she had once tried to forget. The weight of unspoken words, the film's pace picked up. Days turned into long nights filled with lights, cameras, and endless retakes. Keanu's calm presence anchored the crew, while Sandra's warmth lifted everyone around her. Steve's energy kept the mood bright. Everything looked perfect on the surface. But beneath that surface, something invisible moved between Keanu and Sandra. It wasn't love in its usual sense. It was a quiet, lingering connection, the kind that comes back when you least expect it, and refuses to leave even when you try to push it away. One afternoon, the director gathered everyone for a new sequence, a scene filled with tension and heartbreak. It was the emotional peak of the story. Keanu and Sandra's characters had to face each other after years of silence, unable to say what they truly felt. As they rehearsed, Keanu read his lines slowly. I waited for something that never came, and maybe that's my fault for believing silence meant the same thing to both of us. Sandra's character had to respond, but for a moment she froze. She looked into his eyes and the line on the script blurred before her. The director called out, "Sandra, are you okay?" She blinked, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just give me a second." Keanu gave her a soft, understanding look. He didn't say anything, he never did, but she could feel that he knew what she was feeling. Later, when the shoot ended, Sandra walked outside for air. The evening sun was setting, the sky painted in shades of orange and gold. She leaned against a railing, staring at the horizon. Keanu joined her quietly, holding 2 paper cups of tea. He handed her one without a word. She smiled faintly. "You always know when I need tea." "It's easier than talking," he said gently. They stood there for a moment, sipping quietly. Then Sandra said, "That scene, it felt too close." "To what?" Keanu asked softly. She looked at him. "To us." He didn't look away this time. "Maybe because stories find pieces of truth inside the people telling them." She smiled sadly. "You always make everything sound poetic." He shook his head lightly. "No. I just learned to listen to what silence says." A long pause followed. Sandra looked down at her cup, her voice low. "Do you ever think about the past, about what we could have been?" Keanu's expression softened. "Sometimes. But I also think about what we are, and that feels enough." "Enough," she repeated, almost whispering. He nodded. "Not everything beautiful has to be owned. Some things are meant to be remembered, not held." She looked at him with quiet pain. "You really believe that?" He smiled faintly. "I've had to." Her heart tightened. She wanted to tell him that she still cared, that his calm sometimes made her feel even more restless inside. But before she could say anything, a crew assistant called out from the distance. They were needed for another retake. She sighed softly and said, "We'll talk later." Keanu gave a small nod, watching her walk away. That night, Steve posted a picture of the 3 of them laughing together on social media. Sandra in the middle, her arm around Steve, Keanu smiling quietly beside them. The comments flooded in within minutes. The dream trio. Keanu looks so peaceful. Steve and Sandra have such great chemistry. Keanu didn't scroll further. He turned off his phone, placed it face down, and leaned back against the couch. Sometimes what hurt most wasn't what people said, it was what they didn't know. A few days later, they were invited to a charity event hosted by the studio. Everyone was expected to attend. The ballroom was filled with soft music, elegant lights, and the gentle hum of conversation. Keanu arrived early, as usual. He preferred the quiet moments before the crowd. Sandra came later wearing a soft silver dress that shimmered under the lights. She looked graceful, confident, and for some reason distant. When Steve arrived, he went straight to her. They laughed, posed for photos, and talked like old friends. Keanu stayed back, sipping water, watching quietly. He wasn't jealous, just lost in thought. Sandra noticed him from across the room. Their eyes met briefly. She smiled faintly, but he didn't move. A few hours later, the event ended. As people left, Sandra walked outside alone. Keanu followed quietly, his footsteps soft on the marble floor. She turned when she heard him. "You disappeared early," she said gently. "Too loud inside," he replied. "I like the quiet," she smiled. "You always did." For a moment, the night was still. Then she said, "You saw me with him." "Yes, and," Keanu paused, then said, "You looked happy, that's what matters." She frowned slightly. "You always say that like happiness is something you give to others, never yourself." He looked at her, the corners of his lips curling into a small, sad smile. "Some people are just meant to be the quiet behind other people's smiles." Her heart ached at those words. "Don't say that, Keanu. You deserve to be seen too." He looked away. "Maybe. But maybe being unseen is how I understand people better." There was silence. Then Sandra stepped closer. Her voice trembled slightly as she said, "Do you ever get tired of being so calm?" His answer came slow and soft. "Every day." She stared at him, her eyes glistening under the dim streetlight. He took a deep breath. "But calm doesn't mean I don't feel. It just means I choose peace even when my heart is loud." Sandra felt tears pressing behind her eyes. She whispered, "And what if I told you my heart hasn't been quiet since you walked away?" Keanu froze. For a second, time stopped between them. But before he could reply, her driver called out from across the street. She wiped her eyes quickly and said, "I have to go." He nodded slowly, his voice low. "Take care, Sandra." She turned away, but her hands shook as she opened the car door. As the car drove off, Keanu stood under the streetlight, his shadow long and still against the pavement. He whispered softly, "You never walked away. You just smiled in a different direction." The night breeze carried his words away, leaving only silence, the kind that feels heavy, not peaceful. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and promised himself one thing: he would not let his calm become his cage. When calm begins to break, the next few weeks moved faster than anyone expected. The film's trailer had released, and it was already everywhere, on screens, in articles, in conversations. The internet called it a reunion of hearts. The audience could see the chemistry between Sandra and Keanu, even through the short clips. But behind that calm chemistry on camera, there was a storm neither of them spoke about. It was late evening when Sandra knocked softly on Keanu's trailer door. He opened it, surprised but calm as always. "You weren't at the press event," she said quietly. "Too many questions," he replied. "Too many cameras," she smiled faintly. "You never liked attention." "I liked honesty," he said softly. "And attention often hides it." She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was familiar. Like an old song that hurt but still felt right to hear. "Keanu," she said finally, "there's something I need to ask." He looked at her patiently, waiting. "That night," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "when I said my heart hasn't been quiet since you walked away, did it mean anything to you?" He looked down, his hands tightening slightly. "Everything means something, Sandra, especially what's left unsaid." She took a deep breath. "Then say it now." He met her eyes slowly, steady but sad. "If I say it, will it change anything?" Her voice broke. "Maybe not. But it might heal something." For a long moment, the world outside seemed to fade. Keanu stepped closer, his calm breaking just a little. "You were the only person who ever saw me for who I was," he said quietly. "Not for what I had lost, not for what I carried, but for what I still tried to be." Sandra blinked back tears. "Then why did you let it end?" "Because life doesn't always wait for timing," he said. "And sometimes love shows up before two hearts are ready to carry it." She looked away, tears finally falling. "And now," he smiled softly, the kind of smile that hurts. "Now I think we both carry it differently. You with your light, me with my silence." A knock at the door interrupted the moment. It was Steve. "Hey, they're asking for both of you on set," he said, unaware of what he had just walked into. "Coming," Sandra said quickly, wiping her eyes. Keanu nodded calmly, though his chest still burned with unspoken words. As Steve walked ahead, Sandra lingered for a second near the door. "You always hide behind calm words," she said softly, echoing her old line. Keanu replied, almost whispering, "And you always remember them." On set, they were filming a scene where their characters were supposed to say goodbye. The script said it clearly: she walks away, he watches silently. No tears, no words, just quiet heartbreak. But when the cameras rolled, something real happened. Keanu's voice cracked slightly as he said, "You'll forget me." And Sandra, forgetting the script, replied softly, "I already tried." The director yelled cut, but the room stayed silent. Everyone could feel it that wasn't acting. That was truth wrapped in fiction. After the shoot, Keanu disappeared. He left quietly, not telling anyone where he was going. Sandra tried to call him that night, but he didn't answer. He had driven hours away to the edge of a quiet coastal road. He sat near the water, the wind brushing through his hair. He looked at the waves crashing against the rocks, calm and violent at the same time. It reminded him of himself. He thought about Sandra's eyes, about her voice trembling when she asked him to say it. He thought about all the times he stayed silent because it was easier than being honest. For once, he whispered aloud to the sea, "I loved you then. I love you still." The waves answered with a sound that felt like both comfort and pain. 2 days later, Sandra found a small note on her chair on set. No signature, just words written in Keanu's neat handwriting. "You were right. Silence doesn't heal everything. Sometimes it just hides the truth too long." She folded the note, holding it close to her chest. The tears she had been holding back finally fell, not from sadness, but from relief. For the first time, she felt seen again. That evening, the news broke online that Keanu had taken a few days off for personal reasons. The headlines buzzed with guesses, but Sandra stayed quiet. She knew where his heart had gone to find peace before it broke completely. She called him again that night. This time he answered. "I got your note," she said softly. "I meant it," he replied. "Then come back," she whispered. "Not for the film, for us." He didn't speak for a moment. Then he said, "If I come back, can we stop pretending everything's fine?" She smiled through her tears. "Yes, no more pretending." The next morning, the crew watched as Keanu walked in quietly, his calm restored but softer now, like a man who had faced something deep inside and made peace with it. When Sandra saw him, she didn't rush to hug him. She just looked into his eyes and smiled, the same smile that once broke his calm. But this time it healed him instead. When hearts finally speak the morning after Keanu returned, everything felt different on set. The crew noticed it first, the way his eyes followed Sandra, softer now, not hidden behind calm silence. The way her laughter sounded lighter, no longer mixed with the quiet ache it used to carry. Something unspoken had changed between them. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was real, and that made it stronger. They were scheduled to film the final emotional scene that day. In the story, their characters had to say goodbye one last time, but in truth, neither of them knew if this goodbye would belong only to the film or to their own hearts as well. The set was dimly lit, the air heavy with silence. Keanu stood across from Sandra, his script open but unread. He looked up at her and said softly, "Ready?" She nodded, her eyes already glistening. "Ready," the director signaled. "Action." Keanu began slowly, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I used to think peace meant walking away from everything that hurt. But now I see peace is learning to stay, even when your heart trembles." The line wasn't in the script. Everyone on set knew it, but the director didn't stop him. Sandra took a step forward, her voice breaking as she replied, "And I used to think silence meant strength. But it only made me weak because I stopped saying what my heart really felt." Keanu's eyes filled with tears. "Then say it now," she whispered. "I never stopped loving you." The silence that followed was thick and real, no acting, no performance. Just truth. The director didn't yell cut. He just let the moment breathe. The camera captured everything, the trembling lips, the tears, the look of two people finally letting go of years of quiet pain. After the scene ended, Sandra walked off set and found a corner away from everyone. Keanu followed her quietly. "That wasn't in the script," she said, half smiling. "Neither was yours," he replied softly. She turned to face him. "It felt right." "It was," he said, "because it was honest." Her eyes softened. "So what now, Keanu? Do we go back to silence?" He shook his head. "No, silence helped us survive. But now it's time to live." She took a step closer, her voice trembling. "You mean that?" He smiled, that same calm smile, but this time with warmth behind it. "I do." The next few days were peaceful. They began spending time together outside the studio. Long walks after shooting, quiet dinners, and small talks about everything they had once avoided. One evening, they sat by the riverside, watching the city lights reflect on the water. Sandra broke the silence first. "Do you ever regret how long we waited?" Keanu looked at the lights, his voice calm. "No, sometimes life waits for hearts to grow before they can meet again." She smiled softly. "You always make everything sound so calm." He looked at her gently. "And you always make everything feel alive." For the first time, she rested her head on his shoulder. The moment was quiet, pure, and steady, no grand gestures, just two people finally letting their hearts breathe. But peace doesn't come without testing. A week later, during an interview, a journalist asked Sandra a question that stirred old wounds. "You and Keanu have this rare chemistry. Do you think it's just acting or something more?" The room went silent. Sandra smiled politely, answering carefully. "We share something real, but it's built on respect. That's what keeps it beautiful." Her words were graceful, but the internet twisted them. Headlines spread, "Sandra calls bond with Keanu, just respect." Rumors filled the feeds within hours. Keanu saw it the next morning. He didn't call her, he didn't message. He just stayed quiet, thinking maybe she wanted to protect herself from the noise. But Sandra noticed his silence, and it hurt. Later that evening, she went to his home. When he opened the door, her eyes were filled with worry. "You saw it," she said softly. He nodded. "I did. You know what I meant, don't you?" He sighed, looking away. "I do. But sometimes silence feels too familiar again." She stepped closer, tears forming. "Don't do that, Keanu. Don't hide behind calmness now, not after everything we've said." He looked at her finally. "I'm not angry, Sandra. I just don't want us to become another story that ends because of what people think." She nodded, her voice trembling. "Then let's write our own story, one that doesn't need headlines to exist." For the first time, Keanu smiled with full honesty. "Then let's start now." They sat together that night for hours, talking about life, about pain, about how easy it is to lose yourself while trying to protect peace. They promised not to hide anymore, not behind smiles, not behind silence, not behind time. And when the night ended, Sandra looked at him and said, "You know, your calm isn't a wall anymore." He smiled softly. "That's because you finally learned to knock." She laughed, her tears turning into warmth. When the final day of filming came, the cast gathered for a quiet celebration. Everyone cheered, but Keanu and Sandra stayed off to the side, their hands brushing briefly, like a secret they both cherished. They didn't need words anymore. Their silence now was peace, not distance. The director approached them and said with a smile, "You know, the way you two look at each other, that's not acting, that's truth." Sandra looked at Keanu, smiling quietly. "He's right," Keanu nodded. "Maybe some truths don't need to be acted, they just need to be lived." And for the first time, he didn't hide his smile. The moment that said everything, the film was finished. The editing team worked day and night, and soon the premiere date was announced. It was set to be one of the biggest releases of the year, not just because of the story, but because the world wanted to see Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock together again. But for them, it wasn't about fame anymore. It was about something much quieter, about peace, truth, and what it meant to finally let love breathe after years of silence. The night of the premiere arrived. Flashlights, cameras, and cheers filled the air. The red carpet glowed under the city lights. Reporters called out their names, fans held up posters, and photographers fought for the perfect shot. Keanu arrived first, wearing a simple black suit, calm, steady, humble. He smiled politely, waved softly, and thanked the crowd. When Sandra arrived moments later, the crowd roared louder. She looked radiant, her silver gown shimmering like moonlight. When their eyes met across the carpet, the noise faded. It was like the world had disappeared again, leaving only the two of them. They walked toward each other slowly. Cameras flashed wildly, but they didn't care. "You look calm," she said softly. "You look like a reason," he replied. She smiled, her eyes glistening. "For what?" "For why calm exists," he whispered. And just like that, his calm broke again, but this time beautifully. Inside the theater, as the lights dimmed and the movie began, the audience fell silent. They watched their story unfold, the story of two people who found love through stillness, who lost it through time, and who found it again through honesty. But for Keanu and Sandra, watching it felt like reliving every quiet heartbeat they'd shared. Every silence, every look, every word that had meant something more. Halfway through the film, there came the scene, the one where he said, "Peace is learning to stay even when your heart trembles." The audience went still. Sandra turned slightly toward Keanu. He didn't move, but his eyes glistened in the light of the screen. By the time the film ended, people were in tears. They stood, applauding for minutes. It wasn't just for the acting. It was for the truth that somehow every viewer could feel inside themselves. After the screening, the two of them slipped away from the noise, out onto a quiet balcony overlooking the city. The night was cool, the streets below glowing softly under the lights. Sandra leaned on the railing beside him, her voice gentle. "The audience loved it," he nodded slowly. "They felt it." "You think they understood it?" she asked. He looked at her. "They didn't need to understand it. They only needed to feel what we did." She smiled faintly. "You always talk like a poet," he chuckled softly. "Only when life writes the lines for me." There was silence then, not heavy this time, not filled with what they couldn't say. It was peaceful, warm, alive. Sandra turned toward him, her eyes reflecting the city lights. "You know, I think we spent too many years protecting peace instead of living it." He nodded slowly. "Maybe. But peace led us back here, didn't it?" She smiled. "It did." He looked at her for a long moment, then said softly, "I don't want to go back to silence." "Then don't," she whispered. And for the first time, Keanu let go of every wall he had built, every quiet distance he had used to protect his calm. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers, simple, gentle, real. No flashlights, no audience, no cameras. Just two people who had spent a lifetime learning that love doesn't need to be loud to last. A few months later, the film became one of the year's most talked about stories, not for its fame, but for its emotion. People called it the movie that made silence speak. But for Keanu and Sandra, the real story was the one behind the screen. They continued to see each other quietly, away from the noise, choosing peace over publicity, truth over show. One evening, as they sat in a small cafe, Keanu smiled at her and said, "You know, that first day you smiled at Steve, I thought I'd lost my calm forever." She laughed softly. "And now," he looked at her gently, "now I know calm isn't about silence, it's about being next to the right soul." Her eyes filled with warmth. So after all these years, we finally found peace, he smiled. No, Sandra. We finally found home. The city lights shimmered outside, and the quiet night wrapped around them like a promise. They didn't need to say anything more. Their story had begun with silence, broken through truth, and ended with peace. The kind of peace that only two hearts who truly see each other can ever understand.